Welcome back to Exodus Brothers. Today we're joined by Jenny McGrath, a licensed therapist who specializes in religious trauma and sexual abuse. She is also the author of an upcoming book called Anatomy of a Missionary.
Jenny grew up in fundamentalist Christianity, becoming a missionary at 19, and now works at the intersection of healing, justice, and embodiment. So let's get into it. Jenny, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so let's just start by having you introduce yourself, if you can, what you're up to these days, creatively, professionally.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I am currently calling in from the middle of Texas. I live in a van with my husband and our boxer dog, and we've been zigzagging across the country for the last 16 months. But I am a mental health counselor, and I work primarily with folks who grew up in fundamentalist Christianity, especially around the purity culture era, who are navigating a relationship with their bodies, their sexuality, their view of the world. And so that's kind of the waters that I swim in most of the time.
And can I just ask what sparked the road trip across the U.S.?
Great question. So I'm originally from Colorado, and I moved to Seattle for grad school and was there for 11 years. And there was a lot I really loved about Seattle, but I could not do the gray. It was rough for me. So my husband being from there, it took me many years to convince him that there are other beautiful, amazing places to be. And so this is sort of a long-term scouting trip to see what might be next for us. When we left, we said, I think I know maybe two things about every state, and they're probably both wrong. And so we really wanted to get more of a felt sense of the United States, and especially in this current political moment, there's just been a lot that we've found important to document, to learn, to really have more of a visceral sense of, rather than just thinking that we had an idea of what places or regions were like.
I love that sense of adventure and exploration. I think that's amazing. And also, I'm currently in the rainy, gray Seattle, so I understand.
Yes, sending you some sunshine. Although now we have the opposite problem. We're like melting in Texas. So we're like, we should probably start heading back to Seattle soon.
So can you walk us through your religious upbringing? What kind of environment you grew up in, and perhaps what denomination or movement your family was part of?
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up in Colorado Springs. And so for folks who don't know, that is one, if not the epicenter for white evangelical Christianity. It is the home of Focus on the Family, Navigators, and many other Christian organizations. And that was the world that I grew up in. My dad worked at a Christian book publishing company most of my life, and I was homeschooled most of my life. I had a brief stint in a Christian school in 7th grade, and then I was homeschooled again, and I went to a public high school. And so Christianity, specifically white, more fundamentalist Christianity, was the water I swam in. I really didn't have a lot of exposure to a world outside of that. And I really bought in. By the time I was turning 13, I was begging my parents to get me a purity ring. I really wanted to, live out what I thought God wanted for me. And at the time, that really meant that I thought I would probably be martyred by the time I was 23. And I was really okay with that, and actually kind of almost eager for that day. I had learned that this body, this life wasn't important. What was really important was eternity. And so I lived a lot of my life in a pretty dissociated state. Throughout most of high school, I would ask my parents, what does it mean when you feel like you're dreaming? And they were like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Because at the time, there wasn't a lot of language for trauma or dissociation, or what happens when we have learned that our bodies are evil and dangerous and sinful. And so, yeah, that's sort of the world that I come from. That's what draws me to the work that I do now as well.
Yeah. So like to kind of go back into that some of those details, like focus on the family, for instance. Can you kind of paint a picture of that, how it shaped, your family's views on identity and gender roles and just kind of what life was like in that world?
Absolutely. Yeah. The family, quote unquote, is a very narrow view of family. So it is patriarchal, it's white, it's Christian, it's heteronormative, and that was the world and the identity that my family really bought into. And there was also some flexibility in that. A lot of times when my dad would introduce me to folks, he would say, we had 3 rough and rowdy boys, and then we were really excited to have a sweet, quiet girl. Then we had Jenny. And there was this idea lovingly that I really never actually fit into those gender norms and stereotypes that were expected of me. And that was honestly a big part of what led me, and what I think leads a lot of white women to the mission field, was that I was not content being a pastor's wife or just kind of this person that was going to be called to my husband. I really wanted to try to forge my own path. And so I think there was dissonance that even though I really did buy in hook, line, and sinker to a lot of the ideology that I was swimming in, my body also wouldn't let me, which put me at a dissonance a lot of times with that world.
So it sounds like you have a unique connection to our own story in that you ended up at YWAM in Lakeside, Montana, which is where we grew up. Could you share what your experience was like there?
Yeah, I know. Such an odd connection. I was one of many young white women who watched the Invisible Children film when I was in high school. And as I watched that, I experienced it as God calling me to Africa. And I begged my parents to let me drop out of high school and move there. And they did not let me. And so YWAM was sort of a compromise. They wanted me to go to college, get an education, and I said I didn't need that. I just needed to serve God. And I was very familiar with this Christian phrase at the time that says, God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. And so I was like, I don't need an education. I don't need anything. I have Jesus. So what else do I need? But I also grew up kind of on these double tracks. I had this Christian disembodied track, but then I also grew up as a dancer. And I really think that that is what kept me sane and alive in many ways. And I had thought I would be a professional dancer, but I broke my foot when I was 14 years old. And it was after an experience of sexual abuse. And because of the world of purity culture, I had no context for sexual abuse. And so I blamed myself and thought that God had broken my foot to correct me on the path that I was going, and I needed to serve him. And so there was a woman that came to my high school to talk about a local college. And she had reached out to me, and I said, well, I'm not going to college. I'm going to go to YWAM. And she was like, what base are you going to go to? And at the time, I didn't even know. And she told me about Lakeside, Montana, and that they had a dance track that you could do as part of your discipleship training school. And so it just at the time felt like all of these stars were aligning to bring together these disparate parts of my life into a way that I could try to funnel to serve God, but also do what was my original and true love, which was dancing.
And what year were you there?
2008.
We were there in the late 80s, roughly 87 to 90, but very interesting that we ended up in the same place.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. And it's, when I was there, it was the winter in Montana, and we had all paid thousands of dollars to be there. And we didn't have hot water for our showers for the entire time. My work duty was stripping copper wire so that they could sell it. There's all these things that were kind of normal just because it was the world I grew up in. And then I've over the years talked to people about it, and they're like, yeah, that's not a normal experience for an 18-year-old to be doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Was this a DTS that you did?
It was, yeah. So I was there in 2008 for a DTS. I was with YWAM for a while. I joined Colorado Springs YWAM staff. And then as part of that, I was a field worker in Uganda. So a lot of the time I was by myself in northern Uganda. And then I also did a school of biblical studies with them in South Africa. And then I went back to Montana to do a school of dance in 2011.
I also did a DTS from 2001 to 2002 in Jamaica, and your experience sounds very similar to mine.
Yeah. Wow.
The money thing. I'm curious about the money at YWAM, where that money goes. Do you have any insight on that?
That is something I have wondered for years, because I've added up, again, thousands of dollars for schools, dozens of people doing those schools. And as far as I know, nobody on staff is paid. Everyone is raising their own support. So I don't know where all of that money ends up getting funneled to. It's a great question.
You're paying to be there, right? Essentially, and you're paying for the program. But then, are they using the funds to enrich people's lives there? I'm very curious about that.
I mean, given my living experiences on most of the bases, I would guess not. When I was in South Africa for at least 3 months, the only food that we really had was lettuce, white bread, and mayonnaise and peanut butter. And again, had paid thousands of dollars to be there, and none of the staff were getting paid. And so I don't know. I've wondered it for years. I think it's a great question.
Yeah, I spent about $5,000 to $6,000 on my DTS, basically all of my savings, living in an old dorm with no hot water, washing clothes by hand, eating very basic foods, and just not really getting enough to sustain myself. I ended up having to buy my own food supplies to supplement that, and still ended up losing 10 pounds while I was there. And this is a common complaint that I would hear from fellow YWAMers.
Yeah. And it's not like you did it, or I did it in a place like Switzerland that's like, oh yeah, it's really expensive. It feels like there's a big discrepancy between the money coming in and the lifestyle that it lends itself to.
Yeah, I was curious too. There was an article that The Guardian released recently about YWAM that blew up in the news. The article basically was detailing claims of coercive practices, including public confessions, exorcism-like rituals, and shaming, particularly over sexuality and disobedience. I was curious if you had any experiences like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a lot of times, well, I wouldn't say a lot of times, there were several times where there was these really emotionally evocative services that then usually ended with some type of a confession train, or people standing up just sharing what they had done, usually around sexual sins. And then I just also witnessed a lot of heteronormative teachings. I believe currently, I know it was at least happening a couple years ago, Lakeside, Montana had like a biblical sexuality DTS. And there's a very, very strong focus on quote unquote biblical sexuality being very heteronormative, patriarchal. The bases that I were a part of often said a woman is not called to a mission, she's called to her husband. So whatever mission her husband is called to, that's what she should serve. Yeah, so that was some of the things that I saw. It's really interesting to me with more of the stories that have been coming out from IHOP and various organizations, how few has come out about YWAM. And I think that may speak to many different things. I have no idea exactly, but I find that really curious because I know personally many stories of harm. And I also don't know that many of those have been talked about or shared or, kind of collectively engaged.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like you need the dominoes to start falling, and then it goes from there. Like you need a few people to start speaking out, and then everyone else feels comfortable to start.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I argue in my book is that purity culture really groomed a generation of, primarily I'm talking about young white women, to become missionaries because we were already dissociated and really disconnected from our bodies. And so for years, I would say my body is a machine, and I treated my body as such. And so I think even if there have been experiences of harm, unless someone has been able to be in a healing context and learn how to have a healthy relationship with their body, they might not even know that what they went through was harmful or traumatic, because it's just sort of what's been familiar in their relationship to their bodies and their experiences within fundamentalist Christianity.
Yeah, I was curious how you feel like you were personally affected by the purity culture.
Yeah, I think the biggest way that I was affected is in my own relationship to my own body. For a very long time, I really had no connection to when I was hungry or tired. I was very, very disconnected. And this is sort of like a hilarious but also tragic snapshot for me, is like when people have senior superlatives in their yearbook and they have best smile or most likely to become president, I was voted biggest class klutz. And I think, honestly, a big reason for that is because I was so disconnected from my body and super accident prone because of the level of disconnection that I had.
For sure. And I'm sure that those environments only make you feel more like you're out of, like something is wrong, as opposed to, trying to help you, become attuned to your body and yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. When you're in, 10-degree Montana winter taking a cold, misty shower, it's really hard to feel like you can be totally present in those types of experiences.
I think that's also where self-gaslighting can come into play as well, where you start to doubt your own feelings and experiences. Like, maybe I'm just being too sensitive, or maybe I'm not praying hard enough or trying hard enough. And it can really keep you stuck in those harmful dynamics.
Yes. Yeah. I have probably dozens of prayer journals from over the years, and almost all of them start with, "Dear God, I'm so sorry, fill in the blank." And it's for just normal things. Like, "I'm so sorry I didn't spend enough time with you today. I'm so sorry I, didn't wake up in the middle of the night to pray." And I just had so many, like, just such stringent ideas about how I should be and move through the world that I would never, ever match up to. And so then I would continue to just feel shame about that. And that was ultimately sort of what led me off of the mission field, was my own body. I had months and months and months of boils all over, and
Oh, wow.
they were excruciating. And then I came home for what I thought would be a few months, and I broke into shingles. My immune system shut down. Like, I went to the dentist and had, I think, 7 cavities, which I had never had before. It was just like all of the systems in my body just stopped. And so I ended up, very long story short, going to grad school to try to figure out how to make missionary work sustainable for my body. And then in doing that, and in going to my own therapy, it started this very long journey that I'm still very much on, of learning more about my relationship to my body and how I came to put myself in those types of situations in the first place, which not only perpetuated harm to me, but also made me a pawn to systems of imperialism and white capitalism in the global South.
Yeah. What about the relationship with your family? How did that evolve as your beliefs shifted? Like, are there still tensions, or do you have conversations around faith with your family?
Yeah, and it's definitely been a journey. I first I kind of had my own process of deconstruction that I would say came to a head when I got married. And me and my husband, Sean, made a very, very conscious decision to tell my parents that we were going to get married. And as the youngest and the only girl who grew up in this world, there were a lot of ideas and expectations about what my future husband would or wouldn't do. And so the fact that he didn't ask permission caused a really big rift and many years of kind of bringing up and unearthing my experience in fundamentalist Christianity, which was very different than my parents. I think largely because they became converted into more evangelical Christianity as adults. And so they had a very different experience of learning about hell, learning about sexuality. And so I think it was really hard for them to understand what I was talking about when I was talking about being traumatized by their faith and the faith that I once had. And I'm really grateful that we're able to, many years later, have conversations together, even though we still see the world very differently. I think we're able to understand each other more. I think the more that I have learned about the systems of the Christian right in the United States and the influences that my parents had, the more empathy and compassion I've had for, really thinking that they were doing their best as they were raising their children and doing what God wanted for them. And so for many years, I think I just blamed them. And when I was able to kind of shift that blame to the system, it's allowed more mobility in our relationship to navigate those kinds of conversations.
That's great.
I'm curious when you first kind of came out as being or walking away from the faith, was there a lot of tension there with your family?
Yeah, especially because I was the missionary child. And so there was sort of this sense of like the role that I had played in that narrative and in the belief of the family system. For me to step away from that was, I think, really, really surprising. And a lot of people didn't understand because they were like, wait a second, this was your passion. This is what you spent your life doing. How is this happening? And so there was a lot of confusion. And I think right now, still, there is a lot of concern for my soul and for where I will spend eternity. And I have a lot of empathy for that because there were certain family members of mine that left the faith before I did. And for many years, I was really, really, really distraught about that. And I kind of treated them as a project and really thought like, well, maybe if I get martyred, you'll realize how important my faith was, and then you'll get saved again. Instead of like, well, you're alive and I'm alive, so let's try to get to know each other and figure out how to live this life together. And so I can kind of understand both sides now, which is a really interesting place to be as one who spent years really, 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 really concerned about people's souls. And now I'm one that is really, really, really concerned about people's bodies.
Yeah, I'm curious if those journals of yours very enlightening to take a look back at, to see like where you were like mentally at the time. And I'm sure now it's almost kind of strange, like cognitive dissonance,
Yes. Yeah. They're very enlightening and they're very hard to read. I've had times of like, okay, I just want to sit down and go through them. And I can never get more than a few pages at a time because it really was, I was so tortured. I had a therapist one time that said, once I had kind of gone through a lot of the journey of deconstruction, she's like, it's like you had the opposite of a psychotic break. And that felt really true. Like, it feels like a lot of my life was spent in this system of psychosis that really wasn't connected to reality. And I love that phrase you said about self-gaslighting. That's a lot of what my journals was me trying to deny the reality of what was going on for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you take us back to the moment when things really started to unravel? When doubt set in and you began to step away from the church and your faith?
I definitely had moments. This is hard for me to admit, but I think it's important to admit because in 2012 was when I went to grad school. And I was in this class called Interpersonal Perspectives, and we were supposed to have a debate in front of the class of 100 people about something that we thought we needed to debate. And I debated a fellow class member about why I thought gay marriage shouldn't be legal in the United States. And after that debate, I had several people come up to me and ask if they could talk to me about why what I said was so harmful to them. And that was the first time that there was, not the first time, but it was one of the big times that there was this big clash between my ideology that I was loving people by trying to save them from their own sin, and then them confronting me and saying, no, that's actually not what would be loving to me, and that's not loving to me. And so that was a big one for me. And then I was in a pretty rough relationship for most of grad school that consumed a lot of me. And when I finally got out of that and I met my husband, we were on our second date and he goes, I really like you. You seem really cool. I need you to know that I'm really liberal, and it seems like you have some things that you might want to think about if things were to move forward with us. to which I heard like challenge accepted. And so I was going to read all these books and prove to him why I was actually right. And that's when I dove into scholars like Bart Ehrman and Elaine Pagels and Amy Jill Levine and all of these people that I was like, oh, so this is why I was given vague answers to all of those questions I had over the years, because there's actually really pretty concise answers and they're pretty damning to the ideology that I once had. So once I had that, it was actually a pretty rapid crack, but I'd say I'm still very much on that journey. I think I probably read more books about Christianity than most Christians do, and I still find it really important. And I'm in this like weird area where I'm not an atheist. I do believe there is something that we have no idea about. And so I love the idea of mystery and of creator and spirit. But I think I'll never know what that actually means. I just like learning and trying to seek that.
And I think that's a good, honest approach. And it's perfectly fine to say, I don't know, and admit that. And I'm content not knowing and having a little mystery.
Yeah, I become more and more skeptical of anyone that claims to have answers for anything.
So what does healing look like for you now after walking away from a faith structure that kind of wants to find your identity? Do you have practices or things you do that you find healing?
Yeah. Movement and dance is still my anchor. I find that dance, I can say things that I don't have words or language for. And for me, that does feel like a spiritual experience. And so that has been a huge one for me. Getting out into nature is also just restores my sense of being a body. I often say that my dog is my biggest teacher of what it is to have a body. And so I just try to be more like her every day, where she just is her wants, her needs, her disgusts, all of her things.
Living in the moment.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I'm kind of just like, how do I let my body just be a body is sort of what my healing journey looks like. And so I feel like that looks really different depending on the day. I think getting to explore this country and getting to meet so many amazing people throughout it has also been really healing for me.
That's awesome. And I think that's a great way to look at it. Like, in what ways does your upbringing still affect you today? How does it shape what you do now and how you see the world?
I probably would spend less time reading theology books or books on Christian nationalism. I feel like it's impacted so much of my life. And I was really challenged. I'm blanking on her name right now. She's the author of the book, The Glass Castle. And in an interview once, she asked, if you love where you are, why would you hate where you come from? And that's a really challenging question for me because I really, really love where I am. And if you asked me, like, if I could snap my fingers and not grow up in the world I grew up in, would I? I don't actually know that I would say yes, because I feel like I am deeply grateful for the work I get to do with clients. And I've had so many clients that have come to me that have worked with therapists that don't understand fundamentalist Christianity and have actually done more harm because they don't understand the level of what I really would call mind control and the level of trauma that can come from these systems. And so I think I will probably forever be untangling those conscious and unconscious impacts of this world. And I'm really grateful for the people that I get to kind of navigate that process with.
That's a really, I think, healthy way to look at it. And I think our upbringing informs who we are in a way and who we become in our life. And so I think it's hard to detach from it completely, even if it was a negative experience, because it really shapes you into who you are. So I think that's a great way to look at it.
If you could say something to your younger self when you were back in it, what would you say?
That's a great question. What's so funny is like she was so stubborn. I'm like, I don't even know if she would listen to anything I would tell her. She was so gung ho. But I think I would, if whether or not it got in, there's this sense of me that would want to tell her like, it's okay to relax. Like it's okay to just live your life. After I had started a ministry in northern Uganda and I came home and I would work from 6 a.m. to 1 a.m. almost every day. And that's when my body started to shut down. But there really was this sense of urgency and the sense that, again, that this life didn't matter. And that is one of the things that I grieve, is that I feel like I lost a lot of years of my life that I wasn't present for. Mm-hmm. And for me, life is way more about quality than quantity. And I think there were many years where my quality of life was not one that enjoyed nature. I did, but only to a certain degree, because it was always met with an agenda of how I could proselytize to the nearest person, or what it was God trying to tell me or enlighten me of that day. And so there was never a sense of rest and just being able to like settle and be in the moment. And I would really want that for her.
Yeah, just to be able to do something for yourself.
Yeah.
So earlier you mentioned your book, Anatomy of a Missionary. I'd love to hear more about that. How would you describe the book and what inspired you to write it?
Yeah. So my book shares more of my own journey and my own story, but it also shares a 5-year research project that I've done that includes interviews with other folks who grew up in purity culture and became missionaries. And so what I'm looking at is the psychosomatic impacts of purity culture on particularly bodies of young white women, and how those impacts groomed us to respond to highly effective images of Black and brown bodies in the global South and become missionaries. And I illuminate how purity culture really at its core is a system of racial purity and white supremacy. And so for bodies of young white women, our unique place in that world is one that was harmed by heteronormative patriarchy, but we also had immense privilege and have immense privilege due to the proximity we have to white men within that world as well. And so I share those different stories. I share my own story, and I offer somatic exercises to help folks who were missionaries and part of that world come to understand their own experience in the context of what it was like to grow up in the 1980s, 90s, and become missionaries.
Wow, that sounds powerful. I would love to read it.
Thank you. I can't wait for it to be out in the world.
When's it going to be released?
That's a great question. It's in the early stages of publication right now. And so I don't know. I do have an article, which is also a chapter, which is a shorter version of my book called Pure to Purpose Pipeline. And folks can get that. It is in the book Purity Culture and Its Discontents. I am part of the Purity Culture Research Collective. And so it's various scholars and therapists and professors looking at different aspects of purity culture. So if you can't wait for Anatomy of a Missionary, check that out. But hopefully, fingers crossed, in the next year. I know publication's a slow process.
It is, yeah. Do you have any socials you want to share if people want to follow your work?
Yeah. The best one to follow is probably on Instagram, and it's indwell_movement. And the website is indwellmovement.com.
Perfect. So for listeners who are just beginning to question their beliefs or who feel trapped in religious spaces, what would you want them to hear today?
I would want them to hear that your feelings of feeling trapped are your body's wisdom, that I really believe that we were designed for freedom and for movement. And so where you feel trapped or constricted or unable to move, I would say is a really good place to lean into. One of my favorite thinkers is Rosa Luxemburg, and she wrote, "Those who do not move do not notice their chains." And I think eventually, as we start to move our thoughts in new ways and think about the world differently, I think the first stage is the scariest and the hardest, because we then realize how many chains and how much constriction is there.
Yeah, stagnation is death.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I feel that way if I don't get out and do something with my body.
Same. Yep. I find it difficult to talk about family and loved ones in these types of spaces. And I know that they may even listen to this. And so there's this part of me that just even wants to acknowledge how messy this process is. And I share this not in an intent to kind of scapegoat anyone or point any fingers, but really in a hope that we can work towards our collective liberation the more that we tell true stories about where our thoughts come from, where our movements and our decisions come from. And so that would be my hope in getting to share my story, is that we get to become more free together.
I love that. I think it's totally what you're doing, and I can feel it in what you say. And that's really what we're trying to do with this podcast. Tell our story, but then allow others to tell their story so we can all heal and, be better from it.
Absolutely. I'm so grateful that you're doing this and holding this space.
We definitely appreciate your story, so thank you.
Me too. Yeah, thank you.
That's our conversation with Jenny McGrath. Thank you for joining us today. If her story resonated with you, you're not alone. Healing from religious trauma is a process. And like Jenny said, it starts in the body and it continues in community.
As always, thank you for being here with us. We're grateful for your ears, your stories, and your courage. Until next time, take care of yourselves, stay curious, and keep questioning.